Hello and welcome. Thank you to everyone for joining us today for the Michigan Online Visionary Educators event, Teaching with the Dead. My name is Emily Reich, and I am a design manager for the Center for Academic Innovation. The MOVE series is hosted by the Center for Academic Innovation here at University of Michigan. An important part of our mission is to create a more inclusive and global learning community. We believed an informed, peaceful, and equitable society is dependent on learners everywhere adopting a learning lifestyle. This monthly series will feature experts sharing insights, tools, and discussions on issues relevant to the lives of people around the world. Many of the speakers may be familiar to you, as they are the faculty behind some of our most successful and innovative learning experiences available through Michigan Online. Before we begin today, I would like to tell you that you can submit questions for our panelists in the Q&A section. Also, please know that today's event will be recorded, and the recording will be made available on Michigan Online. So let's get started. Today, I'm joined by Kathleen Alsup, Director of the Division of Anatomical Sciences, Lecturer 4 in Anatomical Science at the University of Michigan Medical School. I'm also joined by Glenn Fox, Director of Anatomical Donations Program, Lecturer 4 in Anatomical Science at the University of Michigan Medical School, as well as Kelly Sullivan, Lecturer 4 in Anatomical Sciences at the University of Michigan Medical School, and last but certainly not least, Rachel Hurwitz, Clinical Subjects Coordinator, the Department of Anesthesiology at Michigan Medicine. Kathleen, Glenn, Kelly, and Rachel, thanks so much for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to Emily for that introduction. We really appreciate you all joining, and we would love to get to know you a little bit better. So I'm going to start a screen share here so that we can kind of get started. As you can see, our discussion today is on teaching with the dead. We would love to get to know our audience, so feel free to message in the chat. What is your background? Why are you joining us today? What are you hoping to learn? Have you ever seen or worked with an anatomical donor? And then do you know anyone who has been an anatomical donor? Looks like we're not getting too many responses, but that is totally okay. Please feel free to use the chat function as much as you would like. We would love to hear a little bit about you all. But to kind of get to know us a little bit, as was mentioned, not sure why I did that. So who are we? My name is Rachel. As Emily introduced, I actually don't work in the Division of Anatomical Sciences. So I am here because when I was an undergraduate at the University of Michigan, I started working in the Division of Anatomical Sciences with Dr. Fox and Dr. Alsup. I was a little nervous about the job at first, considering that it is working with anatomical donors. However, I very quickly learned that the job was truly an incredible place to learn. It was a very, very respectful environment, and that I got to play a unique role in the stories of the donors as well. So with that, this is just a little bit more about our presenters today. So I just wanted to start our conversation by what does it actually mean to be an anatomical donor? So anatomical donors are individuals who donate their body, typically to a university or other sort of medical institution before they pass away. Typically, these are used to teach medical, dental students, residents. A small number can be used in other sorts of educational programs or in research as well. They can be used by surgeons to study new operation techniques or a variety of other purposes. And that's kind of going to be the concept of our talk today. So with that, we have two main themes. The first one is respecting our anatomical donors and viewing them as a first patient. And then our second theme is going to be about how do we teach anatomy virtually, especially with this last year with the COVID-19 pandemic. Obviously, it's hard to be in person in a lot of capacities. So how does that teaching virtually happen? So I just wanted to get started with this little quote. So the medical student who is in an anatomy lab, in some ways, the donor is the first patient. They come to develop a sense of respect for the person. With that, I wanted to ask, why are these anatomical donors used in medical education? What purpose do they serve? So Dr. Alsup, would you be willing to answer that question?
Of course, Rachel. Thank you so much for that introduction, and Emily as well. And this question regarding why are anatomical donors used in medical education is a really big question. And we're going to touch on some components of it in upcoming questions as well. So I want to start really basic, and then we'll kind of build from there, or kind of the big picture here. So in terms of how anatomical donors are used here at the University of Michigan, they're really used in early medical and dental education at the University of Michigan, and then variably throughout later year curricula. And also, very importantly, and sometimes not considered, is that it's also, anatomical donors are also used in research. And so that's another big component of the anatomical donations program. And really what anatomical donors provide medical students, residents, researchers, faculty like myself, is really the opportunity to explore and experience human anatomy and all that comes with it. But probably most importantly there is anatomical variation. It's true that one could really memorize anatomical concepts by looking at an illustration. Students are very smart, they can get at that. But the experience of being able to locate and understand the depths, say where a structure is located, is really an invaluable experience that's really provided by the anatomical donors. There's some really interesting things being done with different technologies, and that's certainly something that we're exploring here at the university as well. But really that valuable and unique experience that we have through dissection of anatomical donors is really irreplaceable. And one of the main things I want to kind of touch on before I stop talking, which sometimes I can go on for a little while, is that dissection is really an exemplary example of active learning. And it always has been and still is active learning at its finest before active learning really became a hot topic in education. And as kind of the superior teaching modality. So working with anatomical donors through dissection allows students to really be able to actively participate in their learning experience. Also, it plays a role in terms of professionality and teamwork and cooperation that is important in terms of early education, but also in terms of professional careers. So there's a lot kind of wrapped up in a fairly complex area of anatomical donors and how we utilize in medical education. But we'll touch on a few more of these topics as we kind of move on. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that wonderful explanation. I think that touched on a lot of the aspects of anatomical donors and their benefits to medical education. So our next question. What does it mean that donors are viewed as a first patient? Dr. Sullivan, would you be willing to answer that question?
Sure. Thanks to everyone who has joined us and to my amazing co-panelists and Rachel, thanks for moderating. They're your first patient as a medical student or even a dental student in the sense that they are the first person you are responsible for. You are responsible for taking care of your donor throughout your dissection experience. And in addition to that care and respect that you give that first patient, they're also going to be your greatest teacher. We think of ourselves as educators, but we've got nothing on the donors. The anatomical donors are really the people that are teaching our students. We're there to be guides and to help them get through it and to help them appreciate things. But the bottom line is that the experience the experience that they gain in the dissection lab of finding structures for themselves and the sense of awe they have for their donors and respect is something that we can't really teach. That has to be something that they experience on their own. So your donor teaches you to be mindful and respectful, and teaches you about a great deal about humility and an appreciation for the person who made the choice to come to us in the first place.
Thank you, Dr. Sullivan. Having worked with anatomical donors through the Division of Anatomical Sciences, that feeling of awe was definitely something I always felt, and I think I always saw it in students as well. So I think that's a great point. Next question here. So clearly this is a very intimate relationship that medical and dental students do develop with their donor. So how is the dignity and the rights of the dead really respected and protected in these dissections? Dr. Fox, would you answer that one?
I'd be happy to. Thank you very much, Rachel, and thank you all for joining us in this discussion. It's something that we are all very passionate about, and I hope we can share that passion with you all today. So the dead, sadly, have very few rights, to be honest with you. In this context, the dead are protected by HIPAA. HIPAA is U.S. legislation. That's the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, and that's what guarantees patients their privacy in treatment. And in terms of the dead, it seals or protects their medical records for up to 50 years. Now, just because the dead are legally depauperate of rights, that doesn't mean that that's how we choose to treat them. At the University of Michigan, in our anatomical donations program, it really begins with a process of informed consent. So there's a lot of communication with people who are interested in being our donors, and the process of how to become a donor will be shared with you all at the end of this presentation. But we communicate with individuals who are interested in donating their bodies for education or scientific research. And so we like to inform them of all the possible uses that they might be employed under as an anatomical donor. We talk to their families. Many people choose to pre-register, so they'll fill out paperwork where they make their wishes known to their family, and upon their death, their donation is executed to the University of Michigan. Now, it's always a very consensual act, so we like to have the family members involved as well, and with everyone understanding the process, we really feel that it best honors the donors legally. Now, once they come to the University of Michigan, if they pass all of our guidelines for being a donor, and they can be somewhat extensive, we take a lot of care and caution in protecting their dignity once they're here. A lot of that is through process, and that's way too boring to be discussed here. But a lot of that is facilitated through communication. So having students understand the magnitude of the gift that these donors provide. So body donation is actually facilitated under the same umbrella of legislation that organ donation is. So that's the Uniform Anatomical Gift Law, or the Revised Uniform Anatomical Gift Law. We call it RUGL for short. And we like to brand ourselves as the gift of knowledge. So our donors are providing us with the opportunity to learn from them and to advance knowledge. And then their families, society, all of us are able to give that gift back through better medical treatments, procedures, information, and understanding. So there's this beautiful reciprocal relationship between our anatomical donors and the rest of society. And students understand that, you know, as Dr. Sullivan was talking about, seeing donors as their first patient, there's such a high degree of reverence, and our culture at the University of Michigan is always one of compassion and care, and that's regardless of these individuals being dead. So, you know, we see the same reverence for anatomical donors as we would for patients in our health system as well. And I'm very proud to be a part of that culture, and I'm very grateful to have colleagues that sustain that culture.
Thank you. I think going off of that idea of how the families get involved in as well, I remember that there's a memorial service every year for the donors. And I think that that is such a huge part of that reverence and respect. Medical students give out flowers to families of donors at that event. You hear from medical students and other people involved in the program with how meaningful and impactful their time in the anatomy lab has been as a way to show the families of the donors how truly incredible that gift is and how impactful it has been on their education. I know that was something to me that was always very meaningful. So do any of the other panelists have anything to add on to that question? Or any other thoughts?
Nope, I think.
All right. So that's most of our questions from theme number 1. If you do have any other questions, again, please feel free to message them in the chat. We do actually have one question that I wanted to ask from the chat. So someone mentioned how they recently saw that a new organ had been discovered last year from anatomical donors. So how does that happen? We've been studying anatomy for hundreds of years. How are we still making these new discoveries? Dr. Alsop, would you like to start and we can maybe bounce around?
So are we talking about the peritoneum? Do we know what we're talking about here?
I'm guessing the mesentery.
Mesentery, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think that I think sometimes a lot of these structures that are messaged as being a new organ are certainly something that we're aware of and that we have been studying for a while. It comes out in the news as a bit more of a splash in terms of it being a new organ. I think in this particular case, we're talking about the mesentery associated with the intestines and kind of, I think, reclassifying it as its own organ. So I think it certainly was known and very much discussed and dissected. It's just kind of packaged in a different way and getting a bit more press. It's kind of how I think of that. Any other thoughts, Dr. Sullivan or Dr. Fox?
Oh, it kind of cracks me up just because, yeah, if they'd asked, if the person doing the reporting had actually spoken with anatomists, they would have known it's not exactly new. But I think, you know, a greater appreciation of any structure within the body, and maybe as science progresses and we have a little bit better understanding of what how things are interacting with other organs and maybe are more important than we thought they were early on is something that is important for everyone to know. But yes, the mesentery, the peritoneum has been there for a really long time.
Yeah. I think you kind of touched on it really well of, you know, this is an incredibly important region of anatomy. It's very complex. It's, you know, it's very vital to that the region of the abdomen, but it's often considered with the surrounding organs. So to give it a little bit more of a give it a little bit more pizzazz, I think is certainly a good thing when we're talking about the mesentery for sure.
I would also add on that structurally, we've known about it for hundreds of years, but a lot of the buzz is about how it functions. And so the rate of advance of physiological research is absolutely mind spinning. And so, we effectively double our knowledge, something at almost an unbelievable rate. So the amount of knowledge that we understand in physiology, I once heard doubles every 2 years. And I heard that 5 years ago. So I can only imagine how that's changed over time.
So thinking to my time in the lab, I know that there were times where like new variants of different muscles were found. Do you think that kind of wraps into this concept of always discovering or potentially finding new organs or variants? What do you think about that?
I think that it can. I mean, a lot of anatomical variation isn't seen as compelling research, but I do find it interesting. And I do think that it has important ramifications for clinical care. One of the things that I find most compelling about human anatomy, and that's coming at it from the perspective of being a biologist who is largely a comparative anatomist or even a systematist, is that there is such a wide range of intraspecific variation in humans. And one thing that I feel very lucky is that I see new things to me every time I dissect. Every donor is an opportunity for discovery. And that's something that I know that we kick around new technologies, XR technologies, and we're part of that. But that's something that you don't get with virtual reality. The old Forrest Gump trope, you never know what you're going to get. It's true. And I feel lucky to have a job where that level of discovery occurs on a daily basis. And to see that in the faces of students and other colleagues as they navigate dissections is amazing.
That actually goes off of one of the questions we received. This person asked, with the advent of techniques like AR and VR, how would that affect anatomical education in regards to traditional methods? So Dr. Fox, as you mentioned, there's maybe less of that discovery because it's potentially one donor or a few donors that you see through AR and VR. Dr. Sullivan, do you have any other thoughts on what might be beneficial of being in the dissection room versus some of those sorts of materials?
It's with VR and AR and with any atlas, they're averages. An atlas image is an average of maybe hundreds of donors that have been examined and looked at, and it's like the nerve is mostly in this spot. No one looks like the atlas. No one individual is the average. And so by doing the work in the lab, you have the atlases and in VR and AR can provide guidance as to where you're looking for something. But I think of it as kind of archaeology. You know that something wonderful is there. You don't know exactly where, and you have to carefully discover. And so that is, to me, why being in the lab is so important. And like Dr. Fox has said, every time, every donor is unique, and every time it's something new.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that also goes off of another question we had, which is cadaveric dissection still considered an integral part of medical education at the University of Michigan and at US medical schools? I think thus far from our conversation, yes, there's something really, really valuable about being able to work with a donor in regards to learning that respect for patients and viewing them as a first patient, and then also just the amount of discovery and knowledge that can come from it. Dr. Alsop, do you have anything add about kind of medical education and the use of donors there?
Yeah, and I think this is kind of one of the questions I was going to address a little bit later, so I can kind of fit in both. I think that really all different learning modalities are important in terms of anatomical education. So I don't want to, poo-poo any other means of being able to learn anatomy. And we certainly have utilized some as we've gone through the COVID pandemic and having to use online resources. So I think that there's certainly a place for new technologies. I think that a lot of consolidation of anatomical concepts happen at home when you're studying. And so online resources or potentially AR, XR resources can play a very important role there. And as Dr. Fox mentioned, it's certainly something that we're working on here at the University of Michigan as well in terms of creating some of those resources. But I do think that the opportunities that are provided in the lab are so unique and so important in terms of not only the anatomical variation, but the active process of exploring the anatomy and having that responsibility of having to be the one that finds the structure and knows how to get to that structure and knows where it should be, maybe based on looking at some of those other resources as well. So I really think that part of our job as anatomy educators is to really think of how best to meld these different types of learning modalities while not losing some of the important aspects that can come with the unique opportunities that come with dissection.
Wonderful, thank you. So I think that wraps up most of our questions from theme number 1, and that last question especially is a really good transition into our next topic of discussion. So our second theme is this concept of teaching anatomy virtually. As Dr. Alsup said, with COVID-19 especially, there has been more ways to learn anatomy and more kind of different approaches and avenues to anatomical education. So to kind of start this off, get our brains thinking, in anatomy, digital resources saw a large increase in adoption rates, particularly those that provide 3-dimensional models of anatomy, such as complete anatomy, or actual cadaveric images, such as University of Michigan's BlueLink. So with teaching kind of virtually, is there a way that learners can enhance dissection skills during COVID times where they may not be in the lab? Dr. Sullivan, would you answer that one?
Sure. So when it comes to enhancing your actual physical dissecting skills, that is not exactly possible because we don't have a way, we're not at the stage where you can put on a set of gloves and actually feel what it feels like to be in an anatomical donor or working with one. But that being said, there are tons of ways to learn anatomy. And we've been employing some of those. The BlueLink is an amazing resource that was created here by Drs. Fox and Alsup. And what we've been doing with our students when we could not be in the lab was to use a set of imagery and a set of questions to guide them through the anatomical landmarks that they would have been able to experience in the laboratory. So that was part of it. And then when we were allowed back into the lab, even during COVID, we worked really hard, especially Glenn and Kathleen worked really hard with the building folks and the deans and all of the people who were really in charge of making sure, excuse me, that we all were safe, to minimize the number of students in the lab. And so we went from 4 students at a time in a teaching experience to 2. And the, excuse me, and all of the faculty, kind of spread out, and we spread out in the lab because we're very, very fortunate to have really, really beautiful lab space that can accommodate this kind of social distancing. And so we were able to make anatomy lab happen once in the fall of 2020, so that we could actually be in the lab with the donors, with the students. But when it comes to distance learning and some of the other things with our MOOC, we try to verbally walk you through the space of the body. And then there's all kinds of physical landmarks. You know, you can palpate your clavicles. You can palpate, you know, you're right next to, I'm going to forget I lose my nouns every now and then, but right next to the end of your elbow is your ulnar nerve, and you know that is your funny bone. So there's all kinds of bony landmarks that you can use to kind of give yourself an idea of where things are. So all of those kinds of things can come into play if you can't actually get into the lab.
Right. So maybe dissection skills is the one thing that you can't really improve during COVID, but through this distance learning, there are clearly a lot of anatomical concepts that still can be gained. Thank you. So next question, do you all think we're going to continue using this form of anatomical online teaching when the pandemic is over? We're hopefully beginning to be kind of on the upswing with fewer cases, fewer hospitalizations in many parts of the country. Do you think that teaching anatomy online will continue? Dr. Fox, would you like to start us with that one?
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. I absolutely think that online education will continue to be an integral part of students' educations at all levels, whether, you know, it be high school or earlier, university or professional school. I think of when bad things happen, you know, when this pandemic occurred, there were opportunities for us to learn, and there were silver linings, and we learned a lot about how to better facilitate our courses because of this challenge. And we're now facilitating our courses differently, even when we have the option to return to the old ways. And I'm grateful to be at an institution like the University of Michigan with colleagues who are really dedicated to finding a better way forward. And so a lot of the resources that we've developed can be used by students in ways that are more student focused, and we can make better use of our time with people when we do gather for traditional face-to-face. That's not to say that entire courses can't be facilitated online. I think that we're in an era of distance education. And like Dr. Alsop was saying, you know, there isn't one sort of way of teaching anatomy. You know, we like to layer our approaches. We like to use different modalities which are complementary to one another to really provide the best possible education for as many students as we can.
Thank you. Yeah, Dr. Alsop, do you have anything to add to that? Any additional thoughts?
No, I think Glenn kind of summarizes a lot of our missions in terms of taking what we've learned through the pandemic and some of the things we had been working on and forcing us to do it, I think has really been a positive in terms of how we will teach once things return to normal, however that is. But I really think a lot of the online resources really can be used in conjunction with the more traditional methods. And that way you kind of find a way to really hit all students' preferred learning modalities in terms of that. So I think that we've really learned a lot of lessons. We've really been forced to think differently. And I think in the long run, it's really been in terms of anatomy education.
Wonderful, thank you. So then next question here, Dr. Fox, I'm gonna push this one back to you again, but how do you think the reach of anatomical tools can be extended, specifically into some more low resource settings where maybe they don't have a dissection lab, or many anatomical atlases are quite expensive? How can we make anatomy education kind of easier for everyone to access?
I think this is such an important question and an important concept. And this very idea is what was most compelling for us to be involved with the anatomy series MOOC that we have on Coursera and edX. You know, all of us are products of public education. And all of us went to R1 public universities. And now we work at an R1 public institution. And we believe that education isn't a commodity. And so a lot of what we do is bring the education that's available to our University of Michigan students, and we share that with the world. We bypass, you know, the vendors and the holders of copyright by generating original, expert-reviewed content, and we disseminate that ourselves through our websites and our MOOCs. Now, people may opt to participate in our courses and pay tuition or pay for a certificate, but sharing this knowledge with anyone who is interested in learning anatomy is something that is very dear to all of us. And so I would recognize that having a computer or an internet capable device, as well as the access to internet, is itself a luxury for a good part of the world. But, you know, incrementally we make these advances. We allow our resources to be ported onto hard drives to schools where they don't have access to the internet to support their curriculum. You know, we're about sharing our love of anatomy with as many people who are willing to receive that information as possible.
Wonderful, thank you. As I mentioned earlier, I kind of got started working in the Division of Anatomical Sciences on that Blue Link project. And that really kind of gave me the appreciation for making these resources as accessible as possible, because for me, it was so beneficial to be in the lab, but not everyone got that experience. So thank you.
You know, Rachel, if I can interject one moment, I think that it's important to recognize that individuals such as yourself were so key to the success of Blue Link. If it weren't for you and some of your colleagues, you know, Kavya, Selena, Rahul, Alyssa, the list goes on and on. There really would be no Blue Link. It was only through, you know, the hard work and dedication of many student researchers that it was possible. And so, you know, while I'm proud to be associated with it, you know, I think, you know, we all owe you the debt of gratitude for making that happen.
Well, thank you. I certainly appreciate it. It was an experience I loved to be a part of. So next question here. Dr. Alsop, you kind of already touched on this, but I'll just see if you have anything you'd like to add. So how does this dissection-based anatomy curriculum fit into the integrated basic sciences era? Excuse me as my cat decides to try to join our webinar here.
Well, Rachel, you know I always have more to say on that topic. So I think something that's important to note is that all curricula, so all the different components had to evolve with curricular changes. And one of the biggest one that's happened in the not too far past was integration. So integration of all curricular aspects in the early education. So basic sciences, more clinically focused concepts. And really that there are very few anatomy specific courses in say early medical education. They're out there, but they are becoming less frequent, and that is not the case at the University of Michigan. We are very much integrated within systems-based blocks. And Does this mean that there's less time in the anatomy labs? Absolutely. It means that there is less time in the early education, but I think we have a bigger splash in later education than we have had in the past. I also think it really has forced us to think about what we need students to know before they head into, say, the clerkships or into residencies, and really focus in on foundational anatomy. So while things have certainly changed in terms of time, I think in terms of concepts and how we present them, and if students remember them once they get out of lab, I think that has really changed in a positive way in terms of really focusing in on those big picture foundational concepts that we need all the students to know, and to focus in on dissections that are very focused on that. So I think sometimes when people think about anatomy labs, for a first-year medical student, they think of hundreds of hours in the lab, and that certainly has been the case in the past, but it's much more focused, much more intentional in this current iteration that we're in terms of anatomy education. So I think there's certainly a place for dissection-based anatomy curriculum. I think you have to be very intentional in terms of how you do it and what we want the students to focus on. And I think we're finding a really happy medium here at the University of Michigan in terms of utilizing dissection-based curriculum as well as incorporating some of the other learning modalities that we've been talking about here.
Wonderful, thank you. So it sounds like it definitely is still a part of the curriculum. It's just maybe more interspersed or spread out than it would have been previously.
Yeah, I think you summarized that very well. Instead of saying having all of anatomy right when you enter, it's we dissect, the heart at the same time that they're learning about physiology or clinical concepts in terms of that. So I think that in that way, it almost makes it the importance of those anatomical structures really highlighted as you're kind of learning all of these areas at one time.
Great, thank you.
If I could just interject a little bit, the anatomy lab is a perfect place to bring your physiology and histology together with the gross anatomy. Because if you're looking at the heart, then you can think about how cardiac muscle is different from skeletal muscle. You can think about the conduction system of the heart. You can think about even things as basic as how does a pump work. So you can really use anatomy as a place to bring it all together. I think that also helps with our integrated curricula, because you're getting the physiology and the clinical aspects as well as the basic anatomy all at the same time.
Yeah, I think speaking from a student perspective, I remember I took the undergraduate anatomy course pretty early on in my career as a student, and then took some sorts of physics classes and physiology courses later, and having just the understanding of how the heart functions as a pump, and knowing how that kind of conduction down an axon can function ended up really benefiting me in other courses, and I found it to be very valuable. So I think that integration is really important and something that shouldn't be overlooked. So any additional questions on theme number 2, which is again teaching anatomy virtually, please feel free to message them in the chat. Kind of going off of a question we received a little earlier. This person asked about how long the donor is kept for anatomy related education and research, and what actually happens to the donor once their time with us is done. I think especially since the anatomical education has been kind of elongated, it's no longer just a one-year medical curriculum. How does that play a role into the donor's time with us? Dr. Sullivan, would you be willing to answer that one?
I think you should ask Dr. Fox.
Cool, I can do that. Dr. Fox, would you like
anatomical donations?
True, you are the director. This is new since my time. Dr. Fox, would you like to answer that question for us?
I'm happy to. Our donors elect to join us either as temporary donors or as permanent donors. Our temporary donors are with us for 24 months. And at the completion of their time, they're cremated and their ashes are returned to their next of kin. Our permanent donors may be with us for many years, if not decades, depending on the use. And when their time working with us is complete, they're also cremated and they are interred in our memorial gardens. Both our temporary and permanent donors are celebrated on an annual basis at a memorial service. So that's the long and the short of our donors and their time with us.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm not seeing any other questions that we have right now. So again, if anyone has anything that they would like to add, any questions that have come up during our discussion, I'll wait just a moment here. While we are waiting, I'm just going to share a little bit of some kind of the resources that we have. So as Dr. Fox mentioned, with the anatomical donations program, we do have a website so you can learn more about what it means to be an anatomical donor and that whole process. There is a very nice video that I think all of the people on this call are featured in, if you would like to watch that as well. And then, as was mentioned as well, the Blue Link resources are anatomical resources that are free for educational use. As Dr. Fox mentioned, we really want to make sure that anyone who wants an anatomy education and has an internet connection can see those resources. So this is what the first year medical and dental students at University of Michigan use to help facilitate their learning, in addition to dissection in the anatomy lab. And Blue Link is something that is near and dear to my heart as well. Do any of our panelists have anything else that they would like to add? Anything they feel hasn't really been discussed?
You know, I don't really have anything to add. I just thank you all for allowing us to talk about something that we're very passionate about and having an interest in anatomy. If you ever have any questions, you can always feel free to reach out to any and all of us. We'd love to hear from you.
All right. If Dr. Fox and Dr. Sullivan don't have anything to add, I think I'm going to turn it back over to Emily to kind of wrap this up. But once again, from all of us, thank you so much for joining. We really appreciate your attention and your interest in this topic that is, as Dr. also mentioned, so important to everyone here. So
Thank you.
Thank you all. Kathleen, Glenn, Kelly, Rachel, thank you so much. I can absolutely say that I learned a ton today that I did not know about an hour ago about anatomy and dissection-based curriculum. So thank you so much. That was really wonderful insight that you shared with us. To our participants, thank you so much for joining us today, for submitting your questions and engaging in the chat. The MOVE series will be taking a break during the month of August. We'll resume with a new round of innovative presenters in the fall of 2021. You can view past MOVE recordings at online.umich.edu/MOVE. And then for the latest course offerings, events, and conversations, follow Michigan Online on our social media channels, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. And if this topic was of interest to you, I'd encourage you to take part in some of the courses we have online, such as the Foundations in Human Anatomy course series, which features Kathleen, Kelly, and Glenn. Thank you all for joining us today, and we hope to see you again in the fall.